Some heartbreak runs so deep it changes how you breathe, how you wake hoping today might hurt less. For rancher Hank Cole, the year since his wife's passing has been empty conversations with prairie wind and chores that fill time, but not the hollow spaces in his chest. Then, one October morning, 3 baby donkeys disappear from his corral. Panic turns into something Hank hasn't felt in months: wonder. The missing trio is found curled against him as he sleeps beside the stable, choosing his warmth over shelter. A traveling photographer captures the moment on his glass plates. The image finds its way to the territorial newspaper, and suddenly strangers arrive by wagon and horseback. A mission society sends word. Visitors come with questions and offerings. But can 3 tiny donkeys really help carry the weight of a man's deepest grief? Before we journey back to those windswept plains, tell us where you're reading from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're following along, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the oiled paper windows of the Cole homestead, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn plank floor that Margaret had insisted on sanding smooth with her own hands 3 summers past. Hank Cole sat at the same pine table they'd built together in their early years, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The steam had stopped rising an hour ago, but he hadn't noticed. Time had become meaningless in the way that only true grief can make it. He twisted the gold band on his ring finger, Margaret's wedding ring, worn thin from 35 years of her gentle touch. He'd slipped it onto his own finger the day after they'd laid her to rest in the small cemetery behind the territorial church. Unable to bear seeing it sit empty in the wooden box she'd kept her few precious things in. The ring was too small for his thick fingers, but he'd worked it on anyway, and now it stayed there. A constant reminder of promises kept and promises broken by the Lord's will. Outside, the Dakota Territory stretched endlessly in every direction, painted in the muted browns and golds of late autumn. The distant buttes rose like ancient watchtowers, their flat tops already dusted with the first snow of the season. This land had been their dream, claimed with every dollar they'd saved when Hank worked the railroad and Margaret took in washing and mending. They'd walked every acre together, planning where to build the cabin, where to put the stable, where Margaret would plant her kitchen garden. The garden now sat overgrown, choked with tumbleweeds that Hank couldn't bring himself to clear. Margaret's beanpoles still stood in crooked rows, and her sunflowers had gone to seed, their heavy heads bowed toward the earth like mourners at a graveside. She'd always said sunflowers were the most honest flowers. They followed the sun without pretense, and when their time came, they fed the birds and didn't complain about it. A soft whinny from the stable drew Hank's attention back to the present. He'd almost forgotten about the 3 baby burros that had arrived just 2 weeks ago. They'd come from the Hendersons spread down the valley when old Jim Henderson had taken fever and couldn't manage his stock anymore. Margaret would have loved them. She'd always had a soft spot for the small and helpless. These 3 were barely 2 months old, still fuzzy and awkward on their spindly legs, with oversized ears that seemed too big for their small heads. Hank pushed himself up from the table, his joints protesting the movement. At 62, he felt every one of his years, especially in the mornings when the Dakota cold settled into his bones like an old enemy. He pulled on his worn leather vest and stepped onto the narrow porch, breathing in the crisp air that carried the scent of dying grass and distant snow. The stable stood 50 yards from the cabin, its rough-cut boards weathered gray but still sturdy. He and Margaret had raised it together during their second summer here, taking breaks to share water from the well and stolen kisses when they thought no one was looking. Their neighbor, Sarah Chen, had caught them once and teased them about acting like newlyweds. Sarah was a Chinese woman who'd come west after her husband died in the railroad camps, brave enough to claim her own homestead when few women dared such things. That had been 15 years ago, but it felt like yesterday and forever at the same time. Sarah still lived on the neighboring claim, though she was the only neighbor who bothered checking on him these days. a woman of uncommon learning who taught school back in California before coming to the territory. She brought him cornbread he barely touched and tried to coax him into conversations he wasn't ready to have. She meant well, but kindness felt like sandpaper against his grief some days. Inside the stable, the familiar smells of hay and animals provided a small comfort. The 3 baby burros had taken up residence in the largest stall, though they had the run of the stable during the day. Hank had named them on a whim, something Margaret would have insisted on, calling them Biscuit, Honey, and Clover. Simple names for simple creatures who asked for nothing more than fodder, water, and a warm place to sleep. Biscuit, the smallest of the 3, brayed softly when he saw Hank approach. These burros were different from the cattle and horses Hank had raised over the years. They were curious and affectionate in a way that seemed almost human. They'd follow him around the stable, nudging his pockets for treats, and they seemed to sense his sadness in the way animals sometimes do. Doc Martinez, the old Mexican who doctored both people and animals in these parts, had stopped by earlier in the week to check on them. Vicente Martinez was a quiet man in his 60s who'd learned his healing ways from both Spanish priests and Indian medicine men during his wandering years. He'd known Margaret well. They'd both served the community when sickness came calling. She with her herb knowledge and gentle hands. He with his bottles and instruments. They are healthy. "Senor," he'd told Hank, running his gnarled hands along Honey's flanks. "But they need the companionship, see? These little ones, they are made to be together. Without their kind, they become sad, like the old widowers who sit alone in the cantina." Hank had nodded, understanding the feeling more than he cared to admit. He'd been part of a pair for so long that he'd forgotten how to exist alone. Margaret had been his constant companion, his counsel in all things, his anchor in the vast loneliness of the frontier. Without her, he felt like a ship cut loose from its mooring, drifting through days that blended together in an endless cycle of chores and silence. The homestead that had once bustled with purpose now felt too big and too quiet. They'd run cattle here for decades, maintaining a herd of about 60 head on their section of grassland. But after Margaret's consumption, the wasting disease that took her over 4 long months, Hank had gradually sold off the cattle to neighboring ranches. He told himself it was practical. He couldn't manage them alone. But the truth was simpler and more painful. He couldn't bear to tend to life when death had claimed the most important part of his own. Now only the burros remained, along with an old cattle dog named Scout, who'd been Margaret's shadow. Scout was 12 years old, grey around the muzzle and content to spend his days sleeping on the porch in whatever patch of sunlight he could find. The dog seemed to miss Margaret as much as Hank did, though he expressed it by carrying around one of her old work gloves, never chewing it, just holding it gently in his mouth as he napped. The October wind picked up, rattling the stable doors and reminding Hank that winter was coming hard and fast. It would be his second winter without Margaret, and the thought of it made his chest tight with familiar dread. Last winter had been a blur of survival, keeping the cabin warm, feeding the few animals he had left, and counting the days until spring. He'd thought spring might bring some relief from the grief, but it had only brought different reminders of loss. Spring had been Margaret's favorite season. She'd spend hours planning her garden, sketching layouts on brown paper, and ordering seeds from the catalogs that arrived with the mail. She'd hum while she worked, old songs from their courting days back in Missouri, and the sound had been the soundtrack to Hank's happiness. Now spring felt like an empty promise, full of growth and renewal that he couldn't access. As he filled the water trough for the burros, Hank caught sight of his reflection in the still surface. His hair had gone completely grey in the past year, and lines had deepened around his eyes and mouth like furrows in hard soil. Margaret used to say his eyes were the colour of coffee beans, rich and warm. Now they looked tired, older than his years. The burros gathered around him as he worked, their soft noses investigating his pockets and his hands. Clover, the boldest of the 3, pressed her forehead against his leg in a gesture that felt almost like embrace. For a moment, Hank allowed himself to rest his hand on her neck, feeling the warmth of her small body and the steady rhythm of her breathing. These animals didn't know about his loss, didn't understand the weight he carried. They simply existed in the present moment, content with hay and water and the warmth of companionship. There was something both comforting and heartbreaking about their innocence, their ability to find joy in simple things that Hank had forgotten how to appreciate. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the morning mist that had settled in the valley. Soon, Sarah would probably ride over with another offering of food and another invitation to join her for Sunday dinner, an invitation he would politely decline as he had every time before. The isolation had become a habit, a way of honoring Margaret's absence by refusing to fill the space she'd left behind. But as he watched the 3 baby burrows exploring their pen, investigating every corner with curious energy, Hank felt something he hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't happiness, that felt too far away, too foreign. It was more like a stirring, a small crack in the shell he'd built around himself. These creatures needed him, depended on him, and for the first time since Margaret's death, something in the world required his presence rather than simply tolerating it. He finished his morning chores in comfortable silence, the burrows following his movements with interest. When he finally headed back to the cabin, Biscuit brayed softly as if calling him back. Hank paused at the stable door and looked over his shoulder at the 3 fuzzy faces watching him through the rails. "I'll be back directly," he told them, and meant it. It was the first promise he'd made to anything living since Margaret died, and though it was small, it felt like a beginning. The howling wind against the cabin walls woke Hank before dawn. October storms on the Dakota plains could turn vicious without warning, and this one carried the bite of early winter. He lay in his narrow bed, listening to the shutters rattle against their leather hinges, remembering how Margaret used to press close against him during storms like this, her small hand finding his in the darkness. The memory came with its familiar ache, and Hank pushed it away, as he had learned to do with so many others. By the time he made it to the kitchen, the storm had intensified. Rain lashed against the oiled paper windows, and somewhere outside, something wooden was banging against the stable with rhythmic persistence. Hank pulled on his oilskin coat and boots, grabbed his kerosene lantern, and headed out into the teeth of the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, nearly knocking him sideways as he fought his way across the muddy ground between the cabin and stable. The door to the feed shed had come loose and was slamming against the stable wall. That was the sound he'd heard from inside. He wrestled it closed and secured it with the heavy iron bar, his hands already numb from the cold rain. Inside the stable, he expected to find the burrows huddled together in their stall, perhaps nervous from the storm, but safe and warm. Instead, he found the gate hanging open. The latch he was certain he'd secured the night before swinging freely on its leather hinges. The stall was empty. Hank's heart lurched in a way it hadn't since the day the preacher had come, with news of Margaret's fever taking a turn for the worse. He swept the lantern flame across the stable, checking every stall, every corner where 3 small burrows might hide. Nothing. The hay bales stood in neat stacks. The feed bins were undisturbed, but Biscuit, Honey, and Clover were nowhere to be found. "Come on now," he called out, his voice swallowed by the storm's noise. "Where are you hiding?" But even as he searched, a cold certainty settled in his stomach. The stable door that led to the pasture stood slightly ajar, not wide enough for a person to notice easily, but wide enough for curious baby burrows to slip through. In his grief-clouded state the night before, he must have failed to secure it properly. Hank pushed through the door into the driving rain. The pasture stretched out before him, dark and treacherous in the storm. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, stark flashes, showing him empty grassland and scattered cottonwoods bent by the wind. The fence line disappeared into darkness in both directions. "Biscuit," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Honey, Clover!" He began to walk the fence line, his lantern casting a weak circle of light through the rain. The flame flickered and danced, threatening to go out with each gust of wind. His boots squelched in the mud, and twice he nearly lost his footing on the slippery ground. 20 minutes into his search, panic began to claw at his chest. These weren't hardy range animals that could weather a storm like this. They were babies, barely 2 months old, separated from their mothers too early and dependent on human care. In weather like this, they could die of exposure in a matter of hours. The thought hit him with unexpected force. He couldn't lose them too. Not after everything else. Not after spending a year learning to live with loss, only to have it repeated in a different form. The burrows had become more important to him than he'd realized. They were the only living things that depended on him. The only creatures that looked forward to his presence each day. Lightning cracked overhead, close enough that the thunder followed immediately. And in that brief illumination, Hank saw something that made his heart stop. A section of fencing about 100 yards ahead hung loose, the rails scattered where a falling cottonwood branch had torn it down. The gap was easily wide enough for small animals to pass. Through, beyond the fence, lay the old Brennan homestead, 300 acres of wilderness that hadn't been worked since the family moved. Back east 2 years prior, it was a maze of gullies, thick brush, and stands of scrub oak. If the burrows had wandered in there during the storm, finding them would be nearly impossible. Hank squeezed through the gap in the fence, tearing his coat on the splintered rails. The ground on the other side was rougher, thick with wild grass and hidden holes that threatened to turn his ankle. He moved more slowly, holding the lantern high, calling for the burrows until his voice was hoarse. The storm seemed to be intensifying, if that was possible. The rain had turned to sleet, and Hank's fingers were so numb he could barely grip the lantern handle. The flame guttered constantly, and more than once he had to shield it with his body to keep it from going out completely. More than once he stumbled over hidden obstacles, fallen logs, rocks, prairie dog holes that the darkness had concealed. After an hour of searching, he was forced to admit defeat. The property was too vast, the storm too fierce, and the lantern too weak. If the burrows were out here, he wouldn't find them until daylight, if they survived that long. The thought of their small bodies huddled somewhere in the storm, cold and frightened and alone, made his chest tight with familiar grief. He made his way back to the cabin, water streaming from his coat. In the kitchen, he peeled off his soaked layers and stood shivering in his union suit, staring at the cold stove. He should build up the fire, make coffee, maybe ride to Sarah's place for help. But what could she do in this weather that he hadn't already tried? Instead, he sat at the kitchen table in the darkness, listening to the storm rage outside. The cabin felt enormous around him, filled with the echoing absence of everything he'd lost. First Margaret, now the burrows. It seemed the world was determined to strip away everything that mattered to him. Piece by piece, the hours crawled by as he sat there, watching the single window gradually lighten with the approach of dawn. The storm was finally beginning to weaken, the wind dying down to a steady moan instead of the screaming fury it had been all night. By 7 o'clock, the rain had dwindled to a steady drizzle, and pale grey light was seeping through the clouds. Hank dressed in dry clothes and headed back outside. In daylight, the damage from the storm was evident everywhere. Broken branches, scattered debris, and standing water in every low spot. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees overnight, and his breath misted in the cold air. He returned to the gap in the fence and began a systematic search of the old Brennan property. The landscape looked different in daylight, less threatening, but somehow more vast. He could see for miles in every direction, and the thought of 3 small animals lost in all that space made his heart sink. 2 hours into his search, just as despair was beginning to overwhelm him completely, he heard it, a soft, familiar braying barely audible over the wind. He stopped and listened, turning his head to catch the direction of the sound. There it was again, coming from somewhere behind a stand of scrub oaks about a quarter mile away. Hank hurried toward the sound, his boots slipping on the wet grass. As he rounded the trees, he stopped short at a sight that made no sense at first. There, in a small shelter formed by 3 oaks growing close together, was a makeshift bed of fallen leaves and old grass. And curled up in the center of it, fast asleep, was a man. It was himself. He stared at the scene in confusion, his exhausted mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Then slowly, understanding dawned. Sometime during the night, after hours of searching in the storm, he had found this shelter and collapsed here. He had no memory of it. The combination of exhaustion, cold, and emotional strain had created a gap in his recollection, and pressed against his sleeping form, warm and safe and breathing steadily, were Biscuit, Honey, and Clover. The 3 baby burrows had found him in the storm, had somehow tracked him to this shelter and curled up against his unconscious body for warmth. They looked peaceful, content, their fuzzy coats dry despite the storm that had raged around them all night. As Hank stared at the impossible scene, he heard hoofbeats behind him. He turned to see Sarah Chen approaching through the trees on her paint mare, a leather satchel slung across her shoulder and an expression of wonder on her weathered face. "I saw you from the ridge," she said softly, not wanting to wake the sleeping animals. "I was riding over to check on you after the storm, and I saw—" She gestured toward the shelter, then reached for the satchel. "Hank, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. There's a photographer fellow camped down at Miller's Creek. He's traveling through documenting homestead life for some Eastern magazine. Do you think—" Before he could answer, she had already begun sketching the scene with quick, sure strokes in a small notebook she kept for such moments. The sound of his own breathing woke Hank, deep and steady against the shelter of oak trees. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was, or why his body ached in so many places. Then the events of the storm came flooding back, along with the awareness of 3 warm bodies pressed against his side. Sarah was still sitting on her mare at the edge of the trees, her sketchbook balanced on the saddle horn, watching him with a gentle smile. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to wake you." Hank shifted carefully, trying not to disturb the burrows. His joints protested every movement. Sleeping on the ground at 62 was a different experience than it had been in his younger days. Biscuit stirred first, lifting his fuzzy head and blinking in the morning light. His soft braying woke the other 2, and soon all 3 burrows were stretching and yawning like children awakening from a sleepover. "How long was I out here?" Hank asked, his voice rough from shouting through the storm. "I don't rightly know," Sarah said, tucking her sketchbook back into her satchel. "But look at you, you're like a beacon for lost things." The phrase hit him oddly. Margaret used to say something similar when stray animals would show up at their door, or when injured creatures would somehow find their way to their porch. "You have a healing way about you," she'd tell him. Wounded things can sense it. He'd never believed it then, and he didn't believe it now. But as he looked at the 3 baby burrows nuzzling against him, he couldn't deny that something unusual had happened during the night. Animals didn't typically seek out human comfort in storms. They found their own shelter, huddled with their own kind. Yet these 3 had somehow found him in the darkness and chosen to weather the storm, pressed against his unconscious form. "We should get them back to the stable," Hank said, pushing himself to his feet. His muscles screamed in protest, and he had to steady himself against one of the oak trees. "They need feed and water." Sarah nodded, but she was looking toward Miller's Creek with an expression that suggested wheels turning in her mind. "Hank," she said slowly, "that photographer I mentioned, Josiah Blackwood? He's been traveling through the territories for months, documenting frontier life for Harper's Weekly back east." "All right," he said, not understanding why this required such a careful tone. "He's got one of those new portable camera rigs. Can develop glass plates right in his wagon." Hank stared at her. He knew almost nothing about photography. It was still new and expensive, something for city folks mostly. The idea that a picture of him could be seen by strangers back east felt foreign and vaguely unsettling. "I showed him my sketch," Sarah continued, her voice filled with something between excitement and concern. "He rode up to the ridge while you were still sleeping. Hank, he says it's the most powerful image he's seen in all his travels." The Burrows had no interest in photography discussions. They were more concerned with breakfast, and they began moving toward home with the confident expectation that Hank would follow. He did, with Sarah riding alongside, still talking about the photographer and his plans. He wants to develop the picture and send it to his editor in New York, she said. Says it tells a story about the frontier that people back east need to see, not just cowboys and gunfights, but real human moments. The tenderness between a man and his animals. They walked in silence for a while, the burros trotting ahead with surprising energy, considering their night in the storm. Hank was trying to process the idea that strangers in New York might see a picture of him, might find meaning in a moment that had felt so private and unintentional. "I don't understand," he said finally. "It's just me sleeping with some animals. Folks do that all the time out here." Sarah reined in her horse and looked down at him with the expression she used to wear when explaining difficult lessons to her students back in California. "Hank, it's not just about sleeping with animals. It's about what the picture represents. Here's this man who clearly cares so deeply about 3 baby burros that he spent all night in a storm looking for them. And when they found him, they chose his comfort over any shelter. It tells a story about love and connection that people hunger for. They were just cold." Hank said, "Maybe, but that's not what people will see when they look at the picture." She pulled out her sketchbook and showed him her drawing. "Look at it, Hank. Really look." He reluctantly took the book and studied the sketch. She'd captured him curled on his side, his face peaceful in sleep, his arm curved protectively around the 3 small burros. His grey hair was messed with bits of leaves, and his clothes were rumpled, but there was something in his expression, a contentment he hadn't felt in months. The burros looked equally peaceful, their fuzzy bodies pressed trustingly against him. It was, he had to admit, a striking image. But it also felt deeply personal, like looking at someone else's private moment of vulnerability. "I don't want to be famous for this," he said, handing back the sketchbook. Sarah's expression softened. "I know, and I can ride down to Miller's Creek and ask Blackwood not to develop the plates if you want. But Hank, think about what it might do for people. After Margaret died, you've been so cut off from the world. Maybe this is Providence's way of reminding you that you're still part of something larger." They reached the stable, where Hank busied himself with the morning routine. Fresh hay, clean water, a careful check of each burro for injuries from their night outside. They seemed none the worse for their adventure, if anything more affectionate than usual. Clover kept pressing her nose against his hand, and Honey followed him around the stall like a devoted puppy. Sarah remained mounted, watching from the stable doorway. "There's something else," she said. "Blackwood says Harper's Weekly reaches over 100,000 readers. If they publish the picture, it'll be seen from Boston to San Francisco." Hank's hands stilled in the middle of filling the water trough. "That many people? Maybe more. Newspapers pick up stories from Harper's, reprint them in their own pages. Could be 500,000 folks see this before it's done." The number was incomprehensible to Hank. He'd never seen more than a few hundred people gathered in one place, even at the biggest county fairs. The idea of 500,000 strangers looking at his most vulnerable moment made his stomach turn. But as he watched the 3 burros settling into their morning routine, he couldn't deny that something had shifted in him during the night. For the first time since Margaret's death, he had acted on instinct rather than duty. He had searched for these animals not because it was his obligation as their keeper, but because the thought of losing them had genuinely frightened him. "What would it mean," he asked finally, "if this picture gets published?" Sarah dismounted and came to lean against the stall door. "I don't rightly know. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But Hank, I've seen how you've been living this past year like a ghost haunting your own life. Maybe it's time to let the world remind you that you're still among the living." Hank caught sight of his reflection in the water trough, his hair sticking up at odd angles, his face marked with scratches from branches, his clothes still wrinkled from his night on the ground. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had spent the night searching desperately for something he couldn't bear to lose. The question was whether he was ready to let the world see him that way. By the time Hank had washed the mud from his hair and changed into dry clothes, the first wagon was already coming up the rutted trail that served as his drive. He watched from the kitchen window as a modest farm wagon navigated the muddy ruts left by the storm, moving slowly and carefully like its occupants weren't sure they'd belonged there. The wagon stopped near the cabin, and two women climbed down, one elderly with silver hair and a walking stick carved from hickory, the other middle-aged, wearing a heavy woolen shawl that suggested they'd traveled some distance. They stood by their wagon for a moment, looking toward the cabin and stable with expressions of reverence that made Hank profoundly uncomfortable. Sarah appeared from the direction of her own homestead, riding quickly across the field that separated their properties. She reached the visitors just as Hank stepped onto his porch, and he could hear fragments of their conversation carried on the morning wind, saw the picture in yesterday's Tribune, rode 2 days from Deadwood, wanted to see the place where Hank felt his chest tighten. These women had traveled 2 days by wagon to see him, or rather, to see the man from the photograph. Josiah Blackwood worked faster than Hank had imagined. He must have ridden hard to get his plates developed and delivered to the territorial newspaper. The idea of strangers making such a journey made him feel exposed and vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced since the days immediately after Margaret's funeral, when well-meaning church folk had treated him like a curiosity rather than a person. Sarah was walking the women toward the stable, probably to see the burros. Hank could have stayed in the cabin, let Sarah handle the visitors and send them on their way. But something, maybe politeness, maybe curiosity, maybe just the ingrained habits of frontier hospitality, made him walk down from the porch to meet them. The older woman's face lit up when she saw him approaching. "Mr. Cole, I'm Dorothy Whitman, and this is my daughter Linda. We traveled down from Deadwood because your photograph gave us such hope." She spoke with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed the words during the long wagon journey, and Hank could see tears gathering in her eyes. Linda put a supportive arm around her mother's shoulders. "Mama lost Papa 6 months back," Linda explained. "Mine collapsed up in the hills. She's been having a powerful, hard time. And when she saw your picture in the Tribune yesterday, she said it was the first thing that made her smile since the burial." Hank found himself at a loss for words. These women had traveled 2 days by wagon to tell him that his accidental moment of sleep in an oak grove had somehow touched their grief. It felt both overwhelming and oddly intrusive, like they were asking him to carry their emotions along with his own. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said finally. "Because that was what people said, and because he meant it." Dorothy nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. 43 years we were married. I don't know how to be just one person instead of half of two, you know." The words hit Hank like a physical blow. It was exactly how he'd felt every day since Margaret died, described more clearly than he'd ever been able to articulate it himself. He saw Linda watching him, perhaps recognizing something in his expression. "The little burros are beautiful," Dorothy continued, looking toward the stable. "The way they chose to comfort you during the storm, it's like they knew you needed them." "They were just seeking warmth," Hank said. The same response he'd given Sarah, but even as he said it, he wondered if that was entirely true. Animals did seem to sense human feeling in ways that defied easy explanation. More visitors were arriving now. A buckboard with a family from town, another wagon with territorial plates, a pair of riders on horseback who traveled light and fast. Word was spreading through the territory faster than Hank could have imagined, carried by telegraph lines and newspaper routes and the simple human need to share stories of wonder. Sarah moved closer to Hank, perhaps sensing his discomfort. "Maybe we should set up some kind of system," she murmured. "Folk are just going to keep coming." The thought of an endless stream of visitors made Hank's stomach clench. This was his private space, his sanctuary from the world's demands. He'd chosen to homestead in this remote valley precisely because it allowed him to exist without constant human interaction. The idea of turning his land into some kind of pilgrimage site felt like a betrayal of everything he and Margaret had built here. But as he looked at Dorothy's tear-stained face, at the hope in her eyes as she watched Biscuit, Honey and Clover exploring their pen, he couldn't bring himself to turn her away. This woman understood his loss in a way that most people didn't. She was looking for the same thing he was, some sign that life could still hold moments of unexpected. "Grace, you can visit the burrows," he said quietly. "But I don't talk about personal matters much." Dorothy nodded eagerly. "Oh, we don't want to pry. We just wanted to see them and to thank you." "Thank me for what?" "For showing us that love doesn't end when someone passes," Linda answered for her mother. "The picture shows you caring for these animals the way Papa cared for Mama, the way you must have cared for your wife. It reminds us that the capacity for love survives loss." Hank stared at her, unsure how to respond. These women were reading meanings into his actions that he wasn't sure existed, but their interpretation of the photograph was becoming more real than the actual events, creating a story about healing and hope that had taken on a life of its own. Over the next 3 hours, a dozen more visitors arrived. Some came alone, others in small groups. They ranged from young families with children who squealed with delight at the sight of the baby burrows, to elderly couples who stood quietly at the fence, holding hands and watching the animals with expressions of peaceful contemplation. Sarah appointed herself as an unofficial guide, managing the flow of visitors and making sure they didn't overwhelm either Hank or the burrows. She told them the basic story, the storm, the missing animals, the discovery in the oak grove, but she was careful not to share personal details about Hank's life or his loss. Most visitors were respectful, content to observe from a distance and perhaps purchase a small sketch that Sarah had begun making of the burrows. But as word continued to spread through the territory, Hank began to worry about what kind of attention the photograph might ultimately bring to his quiet valley. The morning of the third day brought rain again, a steady drizzle that turned the already churned ground around Hank's cabin into a muddy morass. But the weather didn't deter the visitors. If anything, it seemed to make them more determined, as if the discomfort of the journey somehow added to the pilgrimage's meaning. From his kitchen window, Hank watched a covered wagon struggle through the worst of the mud, its wheels sinking deep enough that the driver had to get down twice to push. Behind it came a smaller cart pulled by a tired-looking mule, and beyond that, 2 more riders on horseback, their heads bent against the rain. Sarah knocked on his door just after dawn, her oilskin coat dripping steadily onto his porch boards. "We've got a problem," she said without preamble. "That last group that came through yesterday, they left their campfire burning. Caught Mrs. Henderson's pasture grass on fire before the rain put it out." Hank set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink. "Anyone hurt?" "No, but it came close to her barn. She's mighty upset, and she's not the only one. The Millers are complaining about folks using their well without asking, and someone left gates open at the Kowalski place. Lost them 3 head of cattle." The guilt settled in Hank's stomach like a stone. These were his neighbors, people who'd helped him and Margaret build their life here. Now his unwanted notoriety was causing them real harm. "I never asked for this," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I know that. But it's here all the same, and we need to figure out how to manage it." Sarah moved to the window and peered out at the growing crowd of visitors. "That photographer Blackwood? He's been back twice. Says Harper's Weekly wants to do a full story about you, not just the picture but your life, Margaret's passing, how you came to the territory." The thought made Hank's chest tight. "I won't do it," I told him as much. "But Hank, he says the story's going to be written whether you cooperate or not. Says he's got enough material from talking to other folks in the valley." Hank felt a surge of anger, not at Sarah, but at the situation spiraling beyond his control. He'd spent a year learning to live quietly with his grief, and now strangers were telling that story for him, shaping it into something that served their purposes rather than honoring his truth. A commotion outside drew their attention back to the window. The wagon Hank had been watching had finally made it to his property, but now its passengers were involved in some kind of dispute with the horseback riders. Voices were rising, though the words were unclear through the glass and rain. "I should go sort that out," Sarah said, but Hank was already reaching for his coat. Outside, He found two groups of visitors in a heated argument about who had the right to approach the stable first. The wagon passengers, a family from what looked like Colorado, based on their clothes, claimed priority because they'd been traveling longer. The horseback riders, local men from the territorial capital, argued that they'd arrived first and shouldn't have to wait. "Folks," Hank said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to settling disputes among ranch hands. "There's no need for quarreling. Everyone's welcome to visit, but we'll do it orderly-like." The argument subsided, but Hank could see the tension in their faces. People had invested time and effort in coming here, and they felt entitled to something in return: access, stories, some kind of meaningful experience that would justify their journey. As the morning wore on, more complications arose. A family with young children had arrived with a sick baby, hoping that being near Hank might somehow bring healing. When Hank gently explained that he had no special powers, the mother broke down in tears, saying they'd traveled 3 days based on what the preacher in their town had told them about the photograph. Another visitor, an elderly man from Nebraska, had brought his own camera apparatus, hoping to recreate the famous scene. He wanted Hank to lie down with the burros and pretend to sleep while he took the picture. When Hank refused, the man became belligerent, claiming he'd paid good money for the supplies and deserved cooperation. By noon, Sarah had to step between two groups of visitors who were arguing about the correct interpretation of what the photograph meant. One group saw it as a sign of God's grace, while another viewed it as proof of the spiritual connection between humans and animals. Both sides quoted scripture and philosophy to support their positions, treating Hank's private moment as a theological text to be debated. The burros themselves seemed bewildered by all the attention. Biscuit had taken to hiding in the farthest corner of the stall, while Honey and Clover grew increasingly skittish around strangers. Doc Martinez stopped by just after lunch and pronounced them stressed, recommending that they be given more peace and quiet. "This cannot continue, amigo," the old healer told Hank privately. "The little ones, they are not made for such crowds. And you look like a man who has not slept in days." He was right. Hank had been up most of the previous night, listening to visitors camping on his property, their conversations and arguments carrying clearly in the still air. Some had even tried to approach the cabin directly, hoping for private audiences or seeking guidance for their own troubles. The final straw came late in the afternoon, when a well-dressed woman from Bismarck arrived in an expensive buggy, accompanied by two men in suits who introduced themselves as her associates. She claimed to represent a group of Eastern investors interested in developing the site into a proper attraction, complete with a hotel, guided tours, and souvenir sales. "Think of the opportunities, Mr. Cole," she said, spreading out rough sketches on his kitchen table without invitation. "We could build a proper road, establish regular stagecoach service, create something that would bring prosperity to the entire valley." Hank stared at the drawings, buildings and fences and signs that would transform his quiet homestead into something unrecognizable. The woman was talking about his life as if it were raw material to be developed, his grief as if it were a resource to be mined. "Get out," he said quietly. She blinked, apparently not accustomed to such direct refusal. "I beg your pardon." "Get out of my house! Get off my land! And don't come back." The woman's pleasant demeanor evaporated. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Cole. This opportunity won't last forever. Eventually, people will lose interest, and you'll be left with nothing but your loneliness again." Her words hit their target, but they also crystallized something in Hank's mind. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of. His private pain turned into public spectacle. His quiet healing transformed into entertainment for strangers. After the woman and her associates left, Hank stood in his empty kitchen, feeling more alone than he had since the day Margaret died. The visitors outside continued their discussions and debates, but their voices seemed to come from a great distance. He realized that in trying to preserve Margaret's memory by isolating himself, he'd created a vacuum that others were now eager to fill with their own meanings and purposes. The question was whether he could find a way to reclaim his story before it was completely rewritten by forces beyond his control. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, carried by the territorial mail rider who had to weave through a half-dozen camped wagons to reach Hank's door. The envelope was thick, expensive paper that felt foreign in Hank's calloused hands. The return address read, Harper's Weekly Editorial Offices, New York City. Hank stared at it for a long moment before breaking the seal. Inside, written in precise copperplate, was an offer that made his head spin. $500 for exclusive rights to his story, plus the promise of ongoing compensation if the tale proved as popular as they expected. $500 was more money than Hank had seen at one time since selling his cattle herd. "What does it say?" Sarah asked. She'd taken to stopping by every morning now, helping manage the constant stream of visitors who showed no signs of diminishing. Hank handed her the letter and walked to the window. Outside, at least 20 people were gathered around his property. Some had erected proper camps with canvas tents, clearly planning extended stays. Others came and went daily, but there were always new faces replacing the ones that left. "This is substantial money," Sarah said, reading over the terms. "You could fix the roof, maybe buy some breeding stock to start rebuilding your herd." The practical part of Hank's mind recognized the wisdom in her words. The homestead needed work, and without cattle, he had little income beyond what he could grow in Margaret's garden. $500 would solve immediate problems and provide security for the coming winter, but the letter's contents felt like selling pieces of Margaret's memory. The editors wanted details about their marriage, their struggles as settlers, her illness and death. They wanted him to describe his grief in ways that would resonate with our readers' own experiences of loss and redemption. "I can't," he said finally. "It's too private." Sarah folded the letter and set it on the table. "I understand. But Hank, what if there's a middle way? What if you could control the story instead of letting others write it for you?" Before he could respond, shouting erupted from the direction of the stable. Through the window, they could see two groups of visitors in heated confrontation. One man was waving what appeared to be a rifle, though whether in threat or emphasis was unclear from this distance. They hurried outside to find the situation escalating rapidly. The man with the rifle, a weather-beaten prospector from the Black Hills, was accusing a group of Methodist missionaries of desecrating sacred ground with their morning prayer service near the oak grove where Hank had been found with the burros. "This ain't no church," the prospector was saying, his voice rising with anger. "And that man ain't no prophet. You're making him into something he never claimed to be." The missionary leader, a thin man in a black coat that had seen too many miles of dust, stood his ground. "We're simply offering gratitude for the message of hope that God has sent through Brother Cole's example." "Brother Cole?" Sarah muttered under her breath. "When did that happen?" Hank stepped between the two groups, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "There's no need for weapons or harsh words," he said. "Everyone's welcome here, but I won't have fighting on my land." The prospector lowered his rifle, but kept his finger near the trigger. "With respect, Mr. Cole, these folks are turning your troubles into some kind of religious circus. Your wife's memory deserves better than that." The mention of Margaret hit Hank unexpectedly hard. In all the chaos of the past week, he'd almost forgotten that this had started with his own grief, his own desperate search for 3 small animals who'd somehow become more important to him than he'd realized. "My wife," Hank said slowly, "would have wanted people to find comfort wherever they could. But she also would have wanted them to treat each other with respect." The missionary leader nodded approvingly. "Precisely our sentiment, Brother Cole. We're here to—" "Stop calling me that," Hank interrupted more sharply than he'd intended. "I'm not your brother, and I'm not anyone's example of anything. I'm just a man who lost some animals in a storm and fell asleep under some trees." The crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation stirred uneasily. Some of them had traveled hundreds of miles based on stories that cast Hank as something more than an ordinary grieving widower. His refusal to embrace that role threatened the meaning they'd invested in their journeys. A woman from the missionary group stepped forward. "But surely you see God's hand in what happened? The way those innocent creatures sought your comfort, the photographer arriving at just the right moment to capture the scene. It's too perfect to be mere coincidence." "Maybe," Hank said. "Or maybe it's just what happened, and folks are determined to make it mean more than it does." His words created an uncomfortable silence. The prospector shifted his rifle to his shoulder and walked away, muttering about goddamn fools under his breath. The missionaries huddled together, apparently debating whether to continue their vigil or move on to more receptive ground. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah touched Hank's arm. That was hard for them to hear. Maybe it needed saying. But even as he spoke, Hank felt the weight of disappointment around him. These people had come seeking inspiration, hope, some kind of meaning to help them make sense of their own struggles. By refusing to be what they needed him to be, he'd taken something precious away from them. Later that afternoon, he found himself alone in the stable with Biscuit, Honey, and Clover. The constant stream of visitors had clearly affected them. They were more nervous than usual, startling at sudden movements and clustering together in the farthest corner of their stall when strangers approached. Biscuit, the smallest and most sensitive of the three, had developed a pronounced flinch whenever anyone other than Hank came near. Watching him cower at the sight of well-meaning visitors made Hank's chest tight with protective anger. These animals hadn't asked to become symbols or attractions. Like him, they'd simply been caught up in circumstances beyond their control. As he brushed Clover's coat, trying to soothe her obvious anxiety, Hank found himself thinking about the letter from Harper's Weekly. $500 was more than charity. It was opportunity. But it was also a contract that would bind him to tell his story in ways that served other people's needs rather than honoring his own truth. The sound of approaching footsteps made all three burrows tense. Hank looked up to see Josiah Blackwood, the photographer, standing in the stable doorway. The man looked different than he had a week ago, less confident, more troubled. "Mr. Cole," Blackwood said, removing his hat. "I owe you an apology," Hank continued, brushing Clover's neck, not trusting himself to speak without anger. "When I took that photograph," Blackwood continued, "I thought I was documenting a moment of frontier life. I never imagined it would cause such a commotion or bring such disruption to your piece. But you sent it to the magazine anyway," Hank said. "I did, and I'll have to live with that decision. But I want you to know I've been watching what's happened here this past week, and it's not what I intended. These people, they're turning your private grief into public theater, and that's not right." Blackwood stepped closer to the stall, and Biscuit immediately pressed himself against the back wall. "Those little ones are suffering from all this attention. And you, forgive me for saying so, but you look like a man who's drowning." The observation hit closer to home than Hank cared to admit. He had been drowning in expectations, in other people's interpretations of his life, in the constant demand to be something more than what he was. "What would you have me do about it?" Hank asked. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, studying the three nervous burrows. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I think I know where to start looking for an answer." The answer came from an unexpected source, old Jim Henderson himself. Hank hadn't seen his former neighbor since the fever had broken, and Jim's family had moved him to live with his daughter in Cheyenne. So when the familiar bent figure appeared at Hank's door that evening, leaning heavily on a walking stick and looking frailer than his 70-some years, Hank barely recognized him. "Jim." Hank stepped onto the porch, genuinely concerned. "What brings you all the way back here? You should be resting, recovering." Jim Henderson's eyes, though dimmed by illness, still held their old sharpness. "Had to come," he said, his voice raspier than Hank remembered. "Been hearing about all this commotion, about them little burrows and that picture. Had to set the record straight." Sarah appeared from the direction of her homestead, drawn by the sight of the unexpected visitor. The three of them stood in the gathering dusk while Jim caught his breath. And Hank noticed that most of the day's visitors had departed, leaving only a few die-hard pilgrims camped in their wagons. "Come inside," Hank said. "You look done in." Jim shook his head. "Best we talk out here where we can't be overheard?" What I got to say, it changes things considerable. Something in the old man's tone made Hank's stomach tighten with a familiar anxiety. Jim, if this is about the Burrows causing trouble, it ain't about trouble, Jim interrupted. It's about why them Burrows came to you in the first place. He paused, studying Hank's face in the dim light. It's about what your Margaret arranged before she passed. The words hit Hank like a physical blow. What are you talking about? Jim leaned heavily on his walking stick and began to speak in the careful, measured way of someone who'd rehearsed difficult words. Your Margaret, she came to see me last winter. This was maybe a month before she took her final turn. She was still getting around some then, but she knew her time was short. Hank felt Sarah move closer, perhaps sensing that whatever Jim was about to reveal would shake the foundations of everything they thought they understood. She was worried about you, Jim continued. Said she knew how you'd likely take to isolation after she was gone, how you'd probably push away anyone who tried to help. Said she'd seen it in you even during the good times, that tendency to retreat when life got too hard. Margaret never said anything like that to me, Hank protested. But even as he spoke, he recognized the truth in Jim's description. Margaret had always been the social one, the bridge between Hank and the rest of the world. Course she didn't. Woman knew you'd argue with her. Try to convince her you'd be fine on your own. Jim shifted his weight, wincing with what appeared to be pain from the long journey. She asked me to do something for her, and I gave my word. Took me near a year to figure out how to keep that promise. The old man reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, yellowed and worn from handling. She wrote this letter, asked me to hold on to it until the right time came. Said I'd know when that was. Hank stared at the letter as if it might bite him. Margaret's handwriting was unmistakable, the careful script she'd learned from the nuns at the convent school, still neat and precise, even in her final months. His name was written on the outside, in letters that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight from the cabin. She knew, Jim said quietly. Somehow, she knew about them Burrows being born on my place last spring. Knew their mama died falling and they'd need special care. And she knew that come autumn, I'd be taking sick and couldn't manage them proper. Sarah drew in a sharp breath. She arranged for them to come to Hank? More than that. She arranged for them to need him. Margaret knew these little ones would bond with whoever raised them from babies. Knew they'd follow that person anywhere, seek their comfort when scared or lost. Jim's voice grew softer. She was counting on that bonding to pull Hank back into caring about something living. The implications of what Jim was saying began to settle over Hank like a heavy blanket. The Burrows' unusual behavior, their determination to find him in the storm, their choice to seek his warmth over any shelter, it wasn't mystical or miraculous. It was the result of careful planning by a woman who'd understood his nature better than he understood it himself. With trembling fingers, Hank unfolded the letter. Margaret's words, written in those final weeks when every day had been a struggle, seemed to glow in the lamplight. My dearest Hank. If you're reading this, it means Jim kept his promise. And it means you've probably spent the better part of a year trying to disappear from the world. I know you, my love. I know how you pull inside yourself when things get hard, like a turtle pulling into its shell. I also know you'll be angry with me for arranging things this way, for not trusting you to find your own path through grief. But Hank, I've watched you for 35 years. I've seen how you handle loss by building walls around yourself until you can barely see daylight. Those 3 little Burrows aren't just animals, my dear heart. They're my last gift to you and my last request. They need someone to love them, and more than that, they need someone who will let them love in return. That's something you forgot how to do after your parents died, something I had to teach you all over again when we first met. I can't be there to teach you this time, but they can. Animals don't judge or pity or demand explanations. They just love, purely and simply, for as long as they're allowed to. Please don't push them away like you're probably pushing away everyone else. Please let them remind you that caring for something fragile and innocent is the best way to honor the love we shared. And Hank, when people come, and they will come, Because love like this always draws notice. Don't let them turn our story into something it wasn't. We were just two people who found each other on a frontier where loneliness could kill as surely as any disease. We made a life together, one day at a time, one small act of love at a time. That's all anyone can do. That's all you need to do now. All my love until we meet again. Margaret Hank's hands were shaking by the time he finished reading. The letter blurred through tears. He hadn't let himself shed since Margaret's funeral. All this time, he'd thought the Burrows' attachment to him was coincidence, maybe divine intervention, possibly just animal instinct. Instead, it had been Margaret's final act of love, her last attempt to save him from his own tendency toward isolation. She was right, wasn't she? Sarah said gently. About how you'd react to losing her? Hank nodded, not trusting his voice. Margaret had known him completely, had anticipated his withdrawal from the world, and planned accordingly. Even in her dying weeks, she'd been thinking about how to take care of him. There's more, Jim said, his voice barely above a whisper. The timing of that storm, of you finding them burrows in the grove, that wasn't chance either. Margaret asked me to make sure they got extra attached to you before winter set in. I was supposed to bring them by more often, let them get used to following you around. But you got sick, Hank realized. Took fever just when I was supposed to start that part of her plan. Then Burrows had to make do with the bonding they'd already formed. When that storm hit and they got loose, their instinct was to find you, to seek the safety and warmth they associated with your presence. The photographer, Josiah Blackwood, who had been quietly listening from the edge of the porch, stepped forward. Then the photograph. It captured something Margaret had deliberately created. More than that, Jim said. It captured proof that her plan worked, that even in his grief, even in his isolation, Hank was still capable of the kind of love she'd seen in him from the beginning. Hank looked out at the few remaining visitors scattered around his property, people who'd traveled hundreds of miles to witness what they thought was a miracle. In a way, they were right, it was miraculous. Not because of divine intervention, but because of the depth of understanding between two people who'd spent a lifetime learning each other's hearts. The question now was what to do with this knowledge, and whether it changed his obligations to the people who'd found hope in a story that was both more and less than they'd imagined. That night, Hank sat alone in his kitchen with Margaret's letter spread before him, reading her words over and over until he could recite them from memory. Jim Henderson had accepted his offer of the spare room for the night. The old man was too frail to travel back to Cheyenne immediately, and truth be told, Hank wasn't ready to let him go. Not yet. Not when there might be more details about Margaret's plan that Jim hadn't yet revealed. Sarah had returned to her own homestead after helping settle Jim in, but not before extracting a promise from Hank that he wouldn't make any major decisions until morning. Sleep on it, she'd said. All of it. The letter, the visitors, that offer from Harper's Weekly. Margaret planned carefully, but she couldn't have foreseen all this commotion. You need to decide what she would have wanted you to do now. But sleep eluded Hank completely. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret in her final months, already thin and pale from the consumption, using her remaining energy to orchestrate this elaborate plan to save him from himself. The image was both heartbreaking and deeply moving, his wife spending her last weeks not on her own comfort, but on his future well-being. Around midnight, unable to bear the confines of the cabin any longer, Hank pulled on his coat and walked out to the stable. The night was clear and cold, with a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. Most of the visitors had settled into their camps, though he could see the glow of a few lanterns and hear the soft murmur of conversations carrying on the still air. Inside the stable, Biscuit, Honey, and Clover were huddled together in their stall, but they stirred when they heard his footsteps. All three came to the rails when they recognized his voice, pressing their soft noses against his hands in the greeting ritual that had become so familiar over the past weeks. She planned it all, didn't she? Hank whispered to them. Every bit of your attachment to me, every reason you had to come looking when you got scared. Clover, the boldest of the three, nudged his palm with her nose, then rested her chin on the top rail. Her dark eyes reflected the lantern light, and Hank found himself wondering if animals could understand more than people gave them credit for. Did these burrows know they were part of Margaret's final gift? Did they sense the weight of responsibility she'd placed on their small shoulders? As he stood there in the gentle warmth of the stable, surrounded by the quiet sounds of animals at rest, Hank began to understand something important. Margaret hadn't just given him the burrows to prevent his isolation. She'd given him a purpose, something to care for, something that depended on him, something that would force him to continue engaging with the world instead of retreating from it entirely. But she couldn't have anticipated the photograph, the publicity, the endless stream of visitors turning his private grief into public spectacle. That was a complication her careful planning hadn't accounted for. And now he had to decide how to honor her intentions while protecting both himself and the animals from exploitation. The sound of footsteps outside made the burrows stir nervously. Hank tensed, expecting another late-night visitor seeking private audience or spiritual guidance. Instead, Josiah Blackwood appeared in the stable doorway, his camera equipment conspicuously absent. Couldn't sleep either, the photographer asked. Hank nodded, not particularly surprised. Blackwood had been camping with the other visitors, but unlike most of them, he seemed genuinely troubled by what his photograph had set in motion. "I keep thinking about what Mr. Henderson said," Blackwood continued, stepping into the stable but maintaining careful distance from the burrows. "About your wife planning all this. It changes everything about the picture, doesn't it?" "Does it?" Hank asked. "Or does it make the picture more meaningful?" Blackwood considered this. "I suppose it depends on how you look at it. Some folks might say it's less miraculous if it was arranged by human planning rather than divine intervention, and others might say it's more miraculous," Hank said. "Takes a special kind of love to plan that far ahead, to think that clearly about someone else's needs when you're facing your own death." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to the soft sounds of the burrows moving around their stall. Finally, Blackwood spoke again. "What are you going to do about Harper's Weekly? About all the attention?" It was the question Hank had been wrestling with all evening. The $500 would solve immediate problems and provide security for the winter. But accepting the money would mean allowing strangers to reshape Margaret's story into something that served their commercial purposes rather than honoring her memory. "Margaret wrote in her letter that people would come," Hank said slowly. "She said I shouldn't let them turn our story into something it wasn't. But she also said we were just two people who found each other and made a life together. One small act of love at a time. That's not the kind of story that sells magazines," Blackwood observed. "No, it's not." Hank reached through the rails to stroke Honey's neck. "But maybe it's the story that needs telling anyway." The next morning brought an unexpected development. Word had somehow spread through the camps that Hank possessed new information about the photograph's origins. By sunrise, nearly 50 people had gathered near his cabin, waiting for some kind of announcement or revelation. Sarah arrived early, accompanied by Doc Martinez, who'd ridden out to check on both Jim Henderson's condition and the burrow's stress levels. The old healer's examination was thorough but gentle, and his conclusions were sobering. "The little ones, they are not thriving," he told Hank privately. "Too much attention, too many strangers. And the old man, he needs proper rest and care. This cannot continue much longer without harm to both." The crowd outside was growing restless. Hank could hear fragments of conversation, speculation about what new revelations might be forthcoming. Some voices carried hope, others skepticism, and a few contained the edge of desperation that spoke to how much people had invested, emotionally and financially, in their pilgrimage to his homestead. "They deserve to know the truth," Sarah said, returning from a reconnaissance mission to gauge the crowd's mood, about Margaret's planning, about what the burrows really represent. "It might disappoint some of them, but it's more honest than letting them continue with their mystical interpretations." Hank knew she was right, but the prospect of addressing so many people made his stomach clench with anxiety. He'd never been comfortable speaking to groups, even small ones. The idea of explaining Margaret's private gift to dozens of strangers felt like another kind of violation. But as the morning wore on and the crowd continued to grow, he realized he had no choice. The speculation was already running wild, with different factions developing different theories about what secrets he might be hiding. Someone had started a rumor that he was planning to sell the burrows to a traveling show. Another story claimed he'd received a vision from his dead wife, instructing him to establish a permanent religious shrine on the property. The letter from Harper's Weekly lay on his kitchen table, awaiting his decision. $500 for exclusive rights to his story, with the promise of editorial control over how it was presented. It was a tempting offer, especially given his concerns about how others might distort the truth. But looking at Margaret's letter beside the magazine's offer, Hank realized that accepting money for their story would fundamentally change its nature. Margaret's gift had been freely given, motivated purely by love and concern for his well-being. Turning that gift into commercial content would honor neither her intentions nor the simple truth of what had happened. Around noon, as the crowd outside grew increasingly impatient, Hank made his decision. He asked Sarah to spread the word that he would address everyone at 2 o'clock after the midday heat had passed and people had time to gather properly. "What will you tell them?" Jim asked from his bed in the spare room. The old man was clearly exhausted from his journey, but his eyes remained sharp with concern. "The truth," Hank said. "About Margaret, about the burrows, about what the photograph really captured. They may not like it, but they deserve to hear it from me, rather than letting others invent their own versions." As the afternoon approached, Hank found himself thinking not about what the crowd wanted to hear, but about what Margaret would have wanted him to say. Her letter had been clear: don't let them turn our story into something it wasn't. But it had also been clear about something else. Love like theirs always drew notice, and when it did, the response should be honest and generous. The question was whether he could find the courage to be both. At 2 o'clock, Hank stepped onto his porch to find nearly 100 people gathered in his yard. They'd come from all directions, some from the camps that had been established around his property, others arriving throughout the day as word spread through the territorial telegraph network. Men and women, young and old, families with children and solitary pilgrims who'd traveled hundreds of miles to be here. Sarah stood near the porch steps, offering moral support with her presence. Doc Martinez waited by the stable, ready to intervene if the crowd's reaction upset the burrows. Josiah Blackwood had positioned himself where he could see both Hank and the crowd. His expression troubled but attentive. The gathering fell silent as Hank appeared. Their faces turned toward him with expressions of expectation and hope. Some held copies of the territorial newspapers that had reprinted his photograph. Others clutched letters or small personal items they'd brought as offerings. A few had children sitting on their shoulders to get a better view of the man they'd heard so much about. Hank looked out at them, feeling the weight of their collective need pressing against him like a physical force. These people had invested time, money, and emotional energy in making the journey here. They'd built stories and meanings around his photograph that had become important to their own understanding of faith, love, and healing. He cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. "Folks," he said, "I appreciate you all coming, though I never asked for this kind of attention. I know many of you have traveled far, and I know you're looking for something, comfort maybe, or hope, or some kind of sign that love persists even in the face of loss." A murmur went through the crowd, voices of agreement and encouragement. Someone called out, "Bless you, Brother Cole," and others echoed the sentiment. Hank held up his hand for quiet. "I need to tell you something important about that photograph, about why those burrows came to find me in the storm. It's not the story some of you might want to hear, but it's the truth. And I think truth is more important than comfort." The crowd grew very still. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of what was coming. "My wife Margaret died just over a year ago," Hank continued, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. Before she passed, she made arrangements, careful, loving arrangements, to help me through the grief she knew would follow. Those 3 burros weren't lost when they found me. They were doing exactly what she'd planned for them to do. He went on to explain Margaret's letter, Jim Henderson's role, the deliberate bonding process that had made the burros seek his comfort when frightened. With each detail, he could see the crowd's reactions shifting, disappointment in some faces, confusion in others, but also a growing understanding of what the story actually meant. So you see, Hank said, what that photograph captured wasn't a miracle in the way some of you might have hoped. It was something else, the result of one person loving another person so deeply that she spent her final weeks planning how to take care of him after she was gone. A woman near the front of the crowd stepped forward. She was elderly, dressed in traveling clothes that had seen hard use, and her eyes were bright with tears. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I came here because I lost my husband 6 months ago, and I've been so lost without him. When I saw your picture, I thought maybe God was showing me that love continues somehow." Hank nodded, understanding the pain in her voice. "Ma'am, I believe love does continue, but maybe not in the way we expect. My Margaret couldn't stay with me, but she found a way to keep loving me even after she was gone. That's not less meaningful than a miracle. It might be more so." Other voices joined the conversation. A man whose son had died in a mine accident said the photograph had given him hope that his boy was somehow still looking after the family. A young couple struggling with infertility had seen in the image a promise that love could create family in unexpected ways. As person after person shared their stories, Hank began to understand something important. The photograph had become meaningful not because of what it literally depicted, but because it had given people permission to believe in the persistence of love. Margaret's careful planning hadn't diminished that meaning, it had deepened it. "Here's what I'm going to do," Hank said finally, when the sharing of stories had run its course. "I'm going to decline that magazine offer. I'm not going to sell our story to people who want to turn it into entertainment. But I'm also not going to hide the truth from folks like you, who've found genuine comfort in what happened here." He looked out at the sea of faces, seeing hope and disappointment, understanding and confusion, all mixed together in the complex way that truth always affected people. "Margaret's burros will stay here with me because that's what she intended. But anyone who wants to visit them respectfully, anyone who finds peace in seeing how love can work through small acts of planning and care, you're welcome. Just remember that they're living creatures, not symbols, and they deserve to be treated with kindness." The crowd was quiet for a long moment, processing what they'd heard. Then slowly, applause began. Not the wild enthusiasm of people getting what they wanted, but the deeper appreciation of people who'd been given something they needed: honesty, and the recognition that real love was more complex and more powerful than any simple miracle. The applause that followed Hank's speech was different from what he'd expected. It wasn't the enthusiastic approval of people getting what they wanted, but something quieter and more thoughtful, the sound of people recognizing truth when they heard it, even when that truth complicated their own hopes. As the applause faded, the elderly woman who had spoken first stepped closer to the porch. "Mr. Cole," she said, "could I ask you something?" Hank nodded, though he felt drained from the effort of addressing so many people at once. "When your wife was making these plans, did she know how much it would help other people too? The folks who would see that photograph and find hope in it?" The question caught Hank off guard. He'd been so focused on Margaret's intentions for him that he hadn't considered the broader implications of her actions. Looking out at the crowd, at faces that showed varying degrees of comfort, disappointment, and contemplation, he began to see the ripple effects of his wife's final gift. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Margaret was always thinking about other folks' needs, always seeing connections between people that I missed. Maybe she did know that this would reach beyond just me and the burros." A man in the middle of the crowd raised his hand tentatively. "Does it change anything knowing it was planned? I mean, those little burros still chose your comfort over shelter during the storm. They still trusted you enough to seek you out when they were scared." Hank considered this. No, it doesn't change that. If anything, it makes it more meaningful. They were bonded to me because Margaret understood that both they and I needed that connection. The love was real, even if it was deliberately created. More questions followed, and Hank found himself drawn into conversations he'd been avoiding for months. People wanted to know about Margaret, about their life together, about how they'd built their partnership on this remote frontier. Unlike the earlier invasive inquiries about his grief, these questions felt respectful, born from genuine interest rather than morbid curiosity. The Methodist missionary, who had clashed with the prospector earlier in the week, stepped forward. Brother, I mean Mr. Cole, does this mean you don't want us to hold our prayer services here anymore? Hank looked at the man, noting the uncertainty in his face. I reckon if prayer brings you comfort, and if it helps you remember that love persists beyond death, then Margaret would approve. She was never one to turn away people seeking solace. Just remember that this is still a working ranch, not a church, and those burros need their peace. The missionary nodded gratefully, and Hank saw several other religious visitors exchange glances of relief. They could stay, could continue finding meaning in this place, but within boundaries that respected both the animals and the property. As the formal gathering began to disperse, smaller groups formed around the yard. Some visitors were clearly preparing to leave, their expectations having been adjusted by Hank's revelations. Others seemed more settled, as if the truth had actually increased rather than diminished their desire to remain. Sarah approached the porch, her face showing both pride and concern. That was well done, she said quietly. But are you prepared for what comes next? What do you mean? Some of those folks are going to leave disappointed, maybe even angry. They've invested a lot in the story they thought they were part of. And the ones who stay, they'll be looking to you for guidance you never asked to provide. As if to prove her point, a small delegation approached the porch. It included the elderly widow, the missionary leader, and 2 families who had traveled from Colorado. Their spokesman was a middle-aged rancher who introduced himself as Tom Bradley. Mr. Cole, Bradley said, we've been talking among ourselves, and we have a proposition. What if we formed a kind of informal association? People who visit here regularly, help with upkeep, make sure the place doesn't get overrun by folks who don't understand what it really represents? Hank frowned. I don't need help running my ranch. Maybe not, the elderly widow said gently, but you might need help managing the attention that's not going away anytime soon. That photograph is in newspapers from here to New York. More people are going to come, whether you want them or not. Bradley nodded. We could set up a system, scheduled visits, guidelines for behavior, maybe even a small fee to help with feed and maintenance. Keep it respectful but sustainable. The idea made Hank deeply uncomfortable. It sounded too much like the commercialization he'd just rejected, even if these people meant well. But as he looked out at his property, at the trampled grass and makeshift camps, at the evidence of how quickly his private space had been transformed, he realized that doing nothing wasn't really an option. The attention was here to stay, and he could either help shape how it developed or let others shape it for him. Josiah Blackwood, who'd been listening to the conversation, stepped forward. What if I helped? He asked. I caused this situation with my photograph. Maybe I owe it to you to help manage the consequences? How? I could document the real story, not for magazines or commercial purposes, but for the people who come here. Create a record of what your wife actually did, what the burrows actually represent. Give visitors something authentic to connect with instead of their own projections. Hank looked around at the faces watching him expectantly. These people weren't trying to exploit him or profit from his situation. They were trying to find a way to honor what they'd discovered here while protecting it from those who might. For the first time since Margaret's death, Hank felt the stirring of something that might eventually become community. Not the isolation he'd wrapped around himself like armor, but not the overwhelming intrusion of recent weeks either. Something in between, a careful balance between connection and privacy, between sharing Margaret's gift and preserving its meaning. All right, he said finally, let's try it. But we do this carefully, and we do it Margaret's way, with respect for the animals and the land. and with honesty about what this place really represents. The relief on their faces was immediate and palpable. They had found a way to stay connected to something meaningful while allowing Hank to maintain control over his own story. It wasn't the ending any of them had expected, but it felt like a beginning. 3 months later, the first snow of winter was falling softly outside Hank's kitchen window, each flake catching the lamplight like tiny stars before settling onto the ground. He sat at the same oak table where he'd spent so many mornings staring into cold coffee. But now the table held something different: a letter from his sister in Missouri, a sketchpad where Sarah had been drawing the burrows for the visitor's record book, and a tin of cookies sent by the Methodist ladies who had taken to bringing supplies every few weeks. The quiet was different now, too. Not the hollow silence of isolation, but the comfortable stillness of evening settling over a place where people lived and worked and found meaning. From the stable came the soft sounds of Biscuit, Honey and Clover settling in for the night, their contentment audible in the gentle shuffling of hooves and occasional satisfied snorts, the arrangement they'd worked out with the regular visitors had evolved into something none of them had quite expected. Tom Bradley and his informal association had indeed helped manage the flow of pilgrims, but more than that, they'd become something like an extended family. The elderly widow, whose name was Dorothy Mason, had taken to spending her winters in the valley, helping Sarah with her teaching duties for the few children on scattered homesteads. The Methodist group had built a small chapel on Sarah's property, where they could hold their services without disturbing the animals. Josiah Blackwood had kept his promise to document the real story. His series of photographs and written accounts had been published in several territorial newspapers, not for commercial gain, but to provide accurate information for people planning to visit. The true story of Margaret's planning hadn't diminished interest in the homestead. If anything, it had attracted a different kind of visitor, people drawn by the authentic love story rather than hopes of witnessing miracles. The Harper's weekly offer had been replaced by something better. A small but steady income from the donations visitors left to help with feed and maintenance. It wasn't wealth, but it was enough to keep the ranch running and to start rebuilding a small cattle herd come spring. A knock at the door interrupted Hank's evening reflections. He opened it to find Sarah standing on the porch, stamping snow from her boots and carrying a covered dish that smelled like cornbread. "Thought you might be getting tired of your own cooking," she said, stepping inside and hanging her coat on the peg by the door. It had become a routine of sorts, Sarah checking on him most evenings, sharing dinner and conversation, sometimes staying late to help with correspondence from people who'd heard about the homestead and wanted to visit. It wasn't romantic, at least not yet, but it was companionship of the kind Margaret had known Hank would eventually need. "How did the visit go today?" Sarah asked, setting the cornbread on the table and helping herself to coffee from the pot on the stove. "Better than most," Hank replied. "Family from Denver lost their boy in a riding accident last summer. They didn't come looking for miracles, just wanted to see a place where love had found a way to continue working after death." Sarah nodded. They'd learned to recognize the different types of visitors, those seeking spectacle versus those seeking genuine comfort. The latter were always welcome, while the former were gently redirected to understand what the homestead actually represented. The Burrows were good with them? Clover let the mother brush her for near an hour. "I think it helped." Hank paused, remembering the woman's tears as she'd worked the brush through the Burrows' soft coat. Margaret would have liked that family. They understood what the Burrows really are, living creatures deserving love and care, not symbols to be worshipped. After Sarah left, Hank made his final rounds of the evening. He checked the cabin's doors and windows, banked the fire in the stove, and pulled on his coat for the walk to the stable. The snow was falling more heavily now, promising a quiet night, with no visitors traveling in such weather. Inside the stable, the three Burrows greeted him with their familiar soft whinnying. They were grown now, no longer the awkward babies who had first arrived at his homestead, but still affectionate, and still clearly bonded to him in the way Margaret had planned. Biscuit still sought out physical comfort when nervous, pressing against Hank's legs during thunderstorms. Honey had developed a habit of following him around the property like a devoted dog. Clover remained the boldest, often the first to approach visitors, and somehow sensing which ones needed the comfort of animal contact most. As Hank checked their feed and water, he found himself thinking about Margaret's letter, which he still carried in his shirt pocket. Her words about not letting others turn their story into something it wasn't had proved prophetic. The temptation to commercialize, to sensationalize, to transform private grief into public entertainment had been constant. But by insisting on truth over spectacle, by treating the Burrows as living beings rather than symbols, he'd managed to preserve the essence of her gift. She knew, didn't she? He said quietly to the Burrows. And knew that taking care of you would teach me how to take care of myself again. Clover lifted her head from the hay to look at him with dark, intelligent eyes. In the lamplight, her expression seemed almost knowing, as if she understood her role in Margaret's larger plan. Standing there in the warm stable, with snow falling outside and 3 contented animals for company, Hank realized that something fundamental had shifted in him over the past months. The hollow ache of grief remained, might always remain, but it no longer defined his existence. He'd learned to carry sorrow alongside joy, loneliness alongside community, memory alongside hope for whatever tomorrow might bring. The visitors had given him something unexpected, the knowledge that his love story with Margaret had meaning beyond just the two of them. People found comfort in seeing how love could persist beyond death, how careful planning and thoughtful gifts could bridge the gap between presence and absence. In sharing Margaret's story honestly, he discovered that private love, when witnessed with respect, could become a source of healing for others. As he prepared to head back to the cabin, Hank paused in the stable doorway for one last look at the Burrows. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new stories of loss and hope, new opportunities to honor Margaret's memory by showing how love continued to work in the world. It wasn't the quiet isolation he'd thought he wanted after her death, but it was something better, a life that served others while still honoring his own needs, a community built around truth rather than fantasy, a purpose that gave meaning to both his grief and his healing. The snow was falling heavier now, covering the ground in a blanket of white that would muffle the sounds of the outside world and create the kind of peaceful silence that made everything seem possible. Margaret would have loved nights like this, when the whole world seemed wrapped in quiet beauty. Walking back to the cabin through the falling snow, Hank carried with him the knowledge that some gifts keep giving long after they're received, and that love, once planted thoughtfully, can grow in ways the giver never imagined. Margaret's plan had saved him from isolation, but it had done something more. It had shown him how to transform private healing into shared hope, how to honor the past while embracing an unexpected future. Behind him, the stable glowed with warm lantern light, and inside it 3 Burrows settled into sleep, their work of healing and connection continuing even in dreams.